Please be seated. I open this public meeting of the College of Deans of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam for the PhD ceremony of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities by affirming that from our Christian origins to the present day, we practice science with a sense of wonder and inspired by fundamental values. Prior to the examination, I invited the candidate to give a brief overview of the research on which her thesis is based. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rector. Greetings. In his work, A Black Theology of Liberation, James Cone states, "This country, that is the United States, was founded for whites, and everything that has happened in it has emerged from the white perspective. What we need is the destruction of whiteness, which is the source of misery in the world." James Cone's uncompromising theological critique sets the horizon for my dissertation. He calls for the destruction of whiteness. This is not a call to harm individuals, but a demand that Christians dismantle a racialized system of thought, practice, and imagination that has profoundly shaped Western theology and ecclesial life. Taking Cone's challenge seriously, I investigate how whiteness operates within Southern U.S. Baptist worship spaces and ask how these spaces might be transformed towards more just and faithful expressions of Christian community. The central question guiding my research is, how might a visual ethnographic investigation of whiteness in Southern U.S. Baptist worship spaces inform Baptist ecclesiology? And how might whiteness be transformed in the future within ecclesial settings? This question frames the dissertation's theological, historical, and methodological work. By focusing on what can be seen, architecture, symbols, imagery, and spatial arrangement, this study argues that worship environments are not neutral containers for faith, but active participants in shaping theological imagination. My research begins by establishing the conceptual foundations necessary for examining whiteness. Drawing on cultural theorist Richard Dyer, whiteness is understood not simply as a racial identity, but as an aesthetic and social system that presents itself as universal and unmarked. Whiteness achieves authority precisely by appearing normal, invisible, and synonymous with the human standard. This insight is deepened through the theological work of William Jennings, who argues that whiteness represents a distortion of Christian imagination, an inherited framework born of European expansion and racial hierarchy that reshaped how Christians understood land, bodies, and belonging. I begin by developing historical and ideological frameworks by asking how whiteness has been constructed and perceived through visible markers such as skin color, race, and culture. I trace the ways whiteness has been made both hypervisible in systems of exclusion and hierarchy, and invisible as cultural norm. I examine how white American Christianity has been intertwined with national and racial identity, often reinforced through religious and political imagery. Importantly, I situate myself as a white researcher within the study. As a white scholar, I begin the work of interrogating whiteness from within, acknowledging how my own formation shapes perception and interpretation. This reflexive positioning is not incidental, but essential, as the project insists that whiteness cannot be studied as an external object alone. It must be examined as a lived and embodied perspective. Building on this foundation, I ask how white space itself becomes racialized and shaped by the visualization of white bodies, especially those images of white Jesus. White space is defined as an environment structured by an ideological system that associates whiteness with cleanliness, goodness, order, and moral normativity. I argue that depictions of white Jesus are central to the theological visualization of whiteness. These images do not merely reflect artistic preferences, they participate in a theological system of purity that implicitly categorizes people into saved and unsaved, Christian and non-Christian, worthy and suspect. Engaging Timothy Gurinja's theology of built environment, I explore how theological and racial imageries become embedded in architecture, materials, layout, and design. In this way, whiteness becomes spatially organized and materially reinforced. My research engages the methodology of visual ethnography. Visual ethnography is defined as a method that attends to the meanings conveyed through images, objects, and environments. The autoethnographic dimensions highlight my own role as a researcher in the interpretive process, emphasizing reflexivity and critical self-awareness. My methodology is intentionally dialogical. At the end of the research, two African American scholars critique my interpretations, challenging the limits of white perception, and ensuring that the act of seeing does not remain confined within a white interpretive framework. The core of my ethnographic analysis examines how whiteness is seen and unseen in two predominantly white Baptist worship spaces in the southern United States. Through photographic and video documentation, along with interviews with 4 white participants, I explore how whiteness operates in the visual and material environments. Attention is given to what is centered, what is elevated, what is absent, and what is assumed to be normative. The findings reveal how theological ideas about purity, authority, and belonging are reinforced through spatial hierarchy, aesthetic choices, and symbolic emphasis, even when congregants or ministers understand that these elements are merely traditional or reverent. I then turn towards constructive theological reflection. It is here that the dissertation develops a renewed way of seeing, one that recognizes how whiteness shapes space and place, how the figure of white Jesus is both hyper-visible and conceptually invisible, and how these dynamics influence Baptist understandings of church, community, and holiness. By making whiteness visible, my study opens the possibility for repentance, reimagining, and reform. My research illuminates how Baptist ecclesiologies have been shaped by cultural and racial ideologies. By examining worship spaces as theological texts, this dissertation expands ecclesiology beyond doctrine and governance to include architecture, aesthetics, and material culture as formative dimensions of church identity. I propose that Baptist communities engage in intentional visual and spatial transformation. This involves broadening artistic and symbolic representations to reflect the global body of Christ, reconsidering the theological messages communicated through architectural hierarchy and design, and cultivating worship environments that embodied shared belonging rather than inherited racial norms. Such changes are framed not as cosmetic adjustments, but as practices of discipleships that reshape how congregations imagine God, neighbor, and community. In bringing visual ethnography into conversations with Baptist ecclesiology, this dissertation contributes to wider theological and ethical discussions on race and church formation. It argues that spaces shape souls, and that the redemption of ecclesial life requires attention not only to words and doctrines, but also to walls, images, and materials. At the end of my research, I have found that the process of seeing the unseen in white worship spaces remains unfinished, but newly clarified. In my final analysis, I interweave the critiques of African American scholars with my own conclusions, allowing their insights to reshape how I understand both my findings and myself. Their confirmations, challenges, and suggestions for further research have refined my vision, exposing blind spots and pressing the work beyond description towards transformation. Their voices, I have come to see now more clearly that whiteness thrives as invisibility, and that making it visible in academic and ecclesial life is a moral and theological task. Yet visibility alone is not enough. Decentering and transforming whiteness requires practices that move beyond analysis into action. As a white scholar, I have sought to practice reflexivities in ways that resist performance and tokenism, centering non-white perspectives while remaining accountable for my own work that still may fall short. This dissertation is offered as an invitation to white scholars to center marginalized epistemologies, to white theologians to rethink ecclesial space, and to white congregations to embody justice in their common life. Imperfect though it is, I hope this work joins the wider chorus calling for liberation from whiteness and sparks concrete changes in the church's witness.
Thank you very much. I would now like to hear whether the candidate is prepared to defend the thesis.
Rector, on your authority and as authorized by the College of Deans in accordance to the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, School of Religion and Theology, I am prepared to defend my thesis entitled Seeing Together, a Visual Ethnographic Investigation of Whiteness in Baptist Worship Spaces to Inform Baptist Ecclesiologies and Transform Baptist Ecclesial Practices in order to obtain the degree of Doctor of Philosophy.
The opposition will now be started by Reverend Dr. Hunt from the IVTS in Amsterdam. I welcome you to this meeting online. She's participating online, but I see no. There we have.
I am here. Thank you, Rector Magnificus.
Reverend
On
Hunt.
the yes.
So I was about to say a heartfelt thanks, express a heartfelt thanks for your willingness to participate in the ceremony. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rector. On the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I thank the esteemed candidate for her work, and I would like to ask her the following question. Esteemed candidate, you've just reminded us that you are indeed a white scholar, and in the closing chapter of your thesis, you present the critique you've mentioned by two African-American scholars of your positionality. To what extent does their critique of your work in effect invalidate your research rather than merely, as you have just suggested, refining your vision?
Learned opponent, thank you for that excellent question that I have pondered to a great extent even after submitting my dissertation. If I heard you correctly, you talked about how their critique might even make my work invalid. Part of what I sought through curiosity and a whole lot of humility was whether or not this work would lead to a conclusion like that. I think in and of itself, that is the process. And that even a conclusion that might be drawn like invalid is still a part of our learning as an academic community. And so even if we end up finding answers that we wish not to find, we ourselves are transformed even by our own mistakes. And having the two African-American scholars critique, particularly when it comes to the practice of reflexivity, is a critique that I think all white scholars need to take a word from, because anything that could potentially be performative or come back around to even what is called white innocence is a cautionary tale for white scholars studying whiteness. And so I would even counter the fact that because we found some invalid findings, that the research itself thus is valid and necessary for the academic community.
Dr. Hunt, are you satisfied with this, or do you have an additional point to bring up here at this point?
Thank you, Rector. I think I will leave it there for now. It's possible that if there is time, we may come back to it, but that is fine for now. Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Professor Marshall from the United Seminary of the Twin Cities, of which he is the president, to participate in the ceremony and to ask the question.
Thank you. On the authority of the Rector Magnificus, and by virtue of my right, dear candidate, I pose the following question. How might you better articulate a theological visualization of salvation? I was left without full clarity.
Learned opponent, thank you for your question concerning a theological visualization of salvation. This project centers on Baptist worship spaces. And I do believe that in the study itself, it was not intended to be a theological or systematical theological project, but is really grounded in social ethics. That does not dismiss the reality that I do name aspects of salvation that I do think need to be explored in further research projects, specifically when it comes to how that might look visually concerning a doctrine or a theological investigation of salvation. I do believe that the doctrinal categories such as salvation have often been shaped and sometimes even distorted themselves by whiteness. And what Willing Jennings would call this diseased imagination might even affect how we interpret theological anthropology, and that those studies in and of themselves may have also been racialized as well. And so part of what I did not tap into was the theology of salvation, where I risk reinscribing the very problems that my project sought to expose.
Thank you.
Dr. Schwimak, may I invite you to participate in the opposition?
Thank you, Rector. Dear esteemed candidate, first of all, congratulations on this achievement. You have produced a very fine piece of research. I was very pleased to receive your dissertation for review. This is something completely different, refreshing. I was really, really pleased. Well done. And thank you so much for your presentation. Seems that you have a lot of experience in preaching, so I was tempted several times to say amen. So your work is both creative and important, particularly in the way it brings the visual dimension into religious studies, and if I may add, into theology as well, and we can talk about that, of course. It goes beyond logocentric text-bound perspectives. As has often been noted, that modern Western culture is a culture of the eye. And the visual dimension deserves much deeper engagement in academic work, not only at a superficial or incidental level. However, the term visual ethnography or autoethnography is itself very problematic, given that the visual does not exist independently, but always in relation to people's multisensory experience of the world. Your research highlights the gap between what can be shown and what can be said, a core tension around the sacred anyway, and dealing with the sacred is a tricky business, as we know. The idea that religion and human spirituality are often difficult to articulate in words alone and may in many cases be better shown through attention to the implicit, assumed, and embodied dimensions of lived experience. As I already mentioned in my review, the project still leans strongly on discursive analysis and written text. Given the subject matter, a more sensory approach could be very fruitful. So I have a few very boring methodological questions. On the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, I want to ask you the following questions. To what extent does focusing mainly on the visual limit our understanding of worship and space? And what might we miss when we pay less attention to other senses like sound, smell, movement, atmosphere, performance?
Learned opponent, thank you for that excellent question, specifically on what is the limitation of studying only the visual elements? Well, the limitations are the reality that not everybody can actually see. Blindness is a real lived experience by many all over the world. And part of what I tried to articulate, particularly in chapter 1, was the distinction between a physiological blindness and then an internal blindness, or what I use the term obliviousness. So what is the oblivious nature that we have in a project like this? And obliviousness, meaning the fact that we can understand to some degree the shape, the image, the symbol before us, but how we make meaning of it is based upon our own limitations of seeing. And that seeing, that oblivious nature, is based upon our lived experience, what we are taught to see and not see. And that in and of itself is the distorted nature of whiteness, because it trains our mind's eye as well as our physiological eye how to interpret what we see visually. I think in other studies, it would be fascinating to find how whiteness affects other senses, such as smell. If we are trained to smell what is deemed good and then what is deemed bad, based upon how our lived experience within whiteness would reshape that, as well as other sensory such as textures and touch, hearing, how we hear things as well. Those are wonderful next projects that I hope another academic will take hold of in the future. The limitations of my visual project, I think, were evident in chapter 5 and chapter 6, not just from the participants, but from myself. And choosing specifically to only use white participants as a white scholar illuminated how that in and of itself limited how we saw together. And those limitations exposed whiteness as how it was designed to remain invisible. And so I think in order to create a more robust visual experiment, you have to do it in diversity. And so the more eyes, the more mind's eye, the more diverse people you have seeing together, the better the community will see. And so the limitations of my research were specifically because I only used white participants and white scholars myself, intentionally to see if we could actually see together. And we discovered that that in of itself is a limitation.
For now, it's fine.
The next opponent is Professor Beckford from Queen's Foundation and also the Free University. I invite you to participate in the opposition.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say, first of all, to the esteemed candidate, thank you for this important study. Thank you for displaying both moral courage in your research and also a real political commitment underlying your theological analysis. On the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, esteemed candidate, I would like to ask you this particular question. Your thesis argues that whiteness operates as an invisible norm within Baptist worship space, particularly through images and icons. Could you elaborate on how your use of whiteness and visual ethnography is situated within their broader scholarly traditions?
Learned opponent, thank you for that excellent question. The question I heard you ask was, how does my study of whiteness, specifically as it pertains to white congregations, white icons, specifically in white congregations, has a conversation with a very long history around the study of whiteness?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. The conversation that I explored thoroughly was with theologian Willing Jennings. And his work on imagination was extremely critical to how we even understand how spaces are shaped, specifically how spaces are shaped based upon the image of the white self-sufficient man. And that was extremely illuminating, especially when I was able to walk into spaces and to see not only the icons, in which I'll reference here, but how the space itself was designed to illuminate and to cater towards what Jennings would call the white male body, and how land and space itself is shaped by that. and not just space, but theology and ideology. So in Sanctuary Site 2, which is where we saw predominantly the majority of the icons, specifically the white Jesus icons, those icons were mainly illuminated when they were held in contrast to non-whiteness. And I think this is part of the dialogue that's going on and has been going on in academics, is how is it that whiteness is only seen when it's in contrast to another color? It's always considered opposite of Black, and therefore draws on many ideological issues such as good and bad, whiteness, Blackness, and even theological issues, saved and unseen, clean and impure, unclean. And so where I would situate this in is that there is a robust conversation of how do we even dismantle, deconstruct whiteness when you have these visual markers that are still being portrayed, often innocently, externally, but implicitly shaping and reshaping. One of the conversation partners that I wish I had explored was Kehinde Andrews, who's this predominant Black British scholar who does a lot of work specifically around kind of how the system of whiteness is a global power that's rooted in this colonialism, capitalism, and then racial hierarchy. I think he brings a lot to the conversation that will add to a future project. But he is one of those conversation partners that I would have illuminated if I had discovered sooner. I do draw upon Richard Dyer, who is also a British scholar as well, who does a lot of important work around how whiteness is visualized, not just in religious settings, but also through film, and how film and photography have perpetuated the image of the white male, even the white male savior. And so I think this conversation is robust and continuing to evolve. So excellent question. Thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Forster, Professor of Public Theology and Ethics at this university. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rector Magnificus, esteemed candidate. I also want to begin by thanking you for your thoughtful and courageous study, Seeing Together. Your study engages what I think is an important and pressing theological issue in many churches. I remember some years ago entering into the Central Methodist Mission in the center of Cape Town, one of the historic churches, and seeing the stained glass windows of a white Jesus. These windows were erected in the 1820s when British settlers arrived on African soil. The minister of this church had placed a plaque underneath the windows which said, "This is not a representation of Jesus, but a representation of white supremacy." And this was a very controversial and important statement, I think, to make. Now, the seriousness of your study brings this conversation into the academic debate with a kind of methodological imagination that I think unlocks wonderful opportunities. As I read your text, I could see that you argue that whiteness functions as a distorted way of seeing, and that worship spaces, in a sense, sacramentalize that way of seeing. They place it not only upon the world, but upon the inner worlds of those who enter into those spaces. Now, my questions are intended to press you a little bit. I think you have an excellent study, but in collegiality and in the spirit of rigor, I want to test a little bit some of your theoretical framing and some of the methodological choices that you have made. I'd like to begin in chapter 3. In chapter 3, you argue that visual ethnography enables us to see what is normally unseen. And I think you do a very good job with that. And I was also grateful to see that you included photographs in your study. I think this was important. Later on, in chapter 7, you acknowledge the risk of re-inscribing whiteness and white innocence through reflexivity. Now, I want to read to you just one sentence from the end of your study. And of course, now it goes away. I think it was on page 178, somewhere around there. I can maybe just summarize it. But in there, you summarize that this study is about introducing the readers to a methodology that centers non-white perspectives. Now, that sat uneasily with me, the use of non-white, because the use of a non-category means that you are centering whiteness and placing others around this. So given your claim that whiteness operates through regimes of visibility and invisibility, and that the whitening gaze tries to create space in its own image, how would you respond to this critique?
Learned opponent, thank you for the academic rigor of your question. I too was troubled by the use of non-white to a degree that I went back and forth with my supervisors on the terminology throughout chapter 1 on whether or not to use it. I lean heavily on the work of Richard Dyer, who also struggled with terminology as well. Because of the elusive nature of whiteness itself, it is difficult to treat. And in a study that's all about whiteness, to even use a derogatory or negative reshaping of what is then non-white or outside of whiteness feels uncomfortable for me. And this is why I put in chapter 1, and specifically early on in chapter 2, that I do not recommend using that term unless it is clearly stated how you are treating it in order to illuminate whiteness itself. To use non-white outside of academics without clear explanation, I think is an unjust approach to anything that is not considered white. I say that I have to use language and I have to write things down and I have to describe them visually. Part of what I was illuminating with the term non-white is how it has been treated for centuries, how it is always considered the opposite or superior of anything that does not fall into the category that is always evolving. And that's the tricky nature of whiteness itself. It will reshape itself in order to align with power and status quo, amalgamating who it wants, what groups it wants, what images it wants. And so to keep trying to find language to describe a very aggressive, unjust phenomenon that has been intentional since its beginning makes it almost impossible to find the right word.
Maybe I can push back a little bit on that. So just to say, I agree with everything that you've said. I mean, I think the use of these kinds of terms of erasure are problematic, deeply problematic. I must say I did appreciate the way in which you prefaced it in chapter 1, and it may be an idea to return to that again in the end. But what alternative terminology did you consider?
So I considered the use of color. Do I use the term Black for groups? Do I use the term African American? Language itself has been co-opted by whiteness and by white people so often. So I turned to James Cone, to William Jennings to see what was being used by African American scholars. That too is a range of diversity depending on if they're coming from the United States or if they're coming from other countries. Knowing that my audience would be in the United States, I tried to find terminology that would most connect with them. Treating white and non-white as a color and a non-color, anything outside of that, again, is extremely difficult. Great consideration was taken to try to find the best use of words. So even in its infallible nature, I think it illuminates how whiteness functions in and of itself.
Yeah, thank you. And just to say, I think you did an excellent job with that. And, you know, really, I wish ink to your pen and strength to your arm with this project.
Dr. Hunt, may I ask you to start a second round of questions that we'd like to put to the candidate?
Thank you, Rector Magnificus. Esteemed candidate, thank you for your careful and thoughtful responses to the questions so far. It's been a joy listening to you. In this question, I invite you to turn your research on its head and consider how it might be read from a different perspective. You do, of course, cite white scholars in your research, but I suggest that you have chosen white scholars whose perspective might be broadly similar to your own. Professor Beckford has already quite rightly lauded you for your political commitment, and I joyfully and wholeheartedly echo his words. But how about white scholars whose politics is very different to your own? On page 190, you write this sentence: "This research is an invitation for white scholars to center non-white epistemologies." Here's my question now. In the extremely concerning context of the rise of far-right Christian rhetoric, if a young white male scholar would come to you and say that you are dismissing and devaluing his white epistemology, how would you counter his complaint?
Learned opponent, thank you for that excellent and creative question. How would I counter I think you used the term alt-right male colleague who would come to me saying, with a critique on how I approach whiteness? That question in and of itself would relate to how we see and do not see. And the invitation for curiosity from the one asking the question would be determined upon his ability and willingness to see from a different perspective. The challenge of even introducing these ideas to those who have been, for lack of a better term, wrapped up in the cult of whiteness has become a even pathological issue. And to invite someone who refuses to even acknowledge their own blindness or that whiteness itself exists is at the core of my research. Making whiteness seen, making what is unseen seen. Part of what I have discovered and have learned from the work of scholars before me is that the closer you are to power, the closer you are to whiteness itself, particularly those who are white men, the more blind, the more oblivious you are. And so my invitation would be perhaps to invite him to show me a space or place that he's most comfortable with. And part of the critique that I received from the African American scholars was, how can we get white participants, white churches, to see what they have come accustomed to see? Well, you have to put them in places where they're not accustomed. So in chapter 2, when I introduce my own experience of seeing my own whiteness, would be my invitation to that white male, is to use my own lived experience in Black space, in non-white space, as I term in my dissertation, as a way of illuminating our own whiteness. And so that would be my invitation to that white male, is to put himself in a place that he's not used to being in, put himself in what I would term non-white space.
Thank you, and thank you for your courage in pursuing this research.
Professor Marshall, may I re-invite you?
Thank you, Rector Mathis. Esteemed candidate, you and I share formation in the southern U.S. in Baptist ecclesiology, and we well know the resistance of white male colleagues along the way to our claim to spiritual authority and to enter the realm of scholars. Because you have, as one of the agendas of your research, to interrogate and perhaps transform Baptist ecclesiology through this research, I would ask if attention to Eucharistic theology might balance the analysis of encoded whiteness of baptism.
Thank you, learned opponent. I understand your question to be, how might Eucharistic theology help or enhance this conversation around baptism or Baptist?
You focus primarily on baptism and
Yes.
the iconography of that. I wonder if a capacious interrogation of Eucharistic theology might have enhanced this study.
Thank you. As a fellow Baptist, I place in high regard Eucharistic theology, specifically in those Baptist worship spaces where the Lord's table is front and center, very much as the baptismals are. What I did find in the Lord's table visually in my research is that it is always before the pulpit. And those who were able to stand in the pulpit and preach from the pulpit were often white males. And so I do wonder the correlation, specifically as it pertains to my research, how a visual understanding of the Eucharist, of the table, and who stands at the table to partake, to administer, to be the celibate at the table, is also a implicit understanding of whiteness in and of itself. So I agree that a thorough investigation of Eucharistic theology would be fascinating when it comes to a visual understanding of how spaces are formed. I do think that is beyond the scope of my project, but would be a fascinating next project, specifically as it pertains to comparing the Eucharist, the table, and the baptistry and baptismal theology.
Thank you.
If you have a follow-up, you're invited to do so. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next opponent.
Well, yes, I will. The inclusivity of Eucharist seems to provide a different way to inscribe identity in Baptist ecclesiology. And with the increased number of women who function as pastors in Baptist life, I wonder if this begins to deconstruct the singularity of the sufficient white male.
The deconstruction aspect of your question, I think, is vital, because as we approach whiteness, we need to be looking for ways to deconstruct. And perhaps one pathway could be Eucharistic theology, particularly when we approach the Eucharist, the Lord's table, as all are welcomed. The Lord's table is often symbolized as those who are accepted or unaccepted, specifically in Baptist worship spaces. As one who has participated in a variety of Baptist spaces that were both inclusive and exclusive when it came to the table, I do think a thorough examination of Eucharistic theology could open the door for deconstructing whiteness, particularly when it comes to women, when it comes to people of color, when it comes to diversity that is allowed at the table and those who are allowed to serve.
Thank you.
Dr. Schremak.
Thank you. I have another methodological questions. I'm not one of those scholars who are obsessed with methodology, but I think it's very important for your research. So I'm wondering, I mean, why you didn't make a visual essay? Or you said that aesthetics is really important. And I'm shocked that I haven't seen that you use any visuals in your presentations. This is precisely academic aesthetics, talking heads and white background. So if you develop more a visual essay, or then it can help us to understand better, and not only to believe what you saw and photos that you made, but we can make our understanding out of that. So why you didn't engage more into visual aspects, not only using that kind of visual methodology as a footnote? You know what I mean? It's not really central, and your title is even auto ethnography and visual ethnography.
Excellent question. Why did I not use a visual essay kind of methodology? And the entire dissertation is based upon creating a new methodology to some degree of how we approach this. As you read in chapter 4, my methodology hit many challenges right out of the gate. The ability to access space and the visuals was of the largest issue that delayed my research over a year. Because I was not allowed to come into spaces to look at their visuals. And finding a methodology, finding participating churches was really critical in a study on visual ethnography. And so in my desire to have 4 or 5 sanctuary sites, I was limited to 2 based upon access. And that in and of itself illuminated the difficulty of even studying whiteness visually. And if I might be curious with you, what would it have looked like if I was able to access 4 or 5? I think there would be more images for sure. There would be, I would have been able to lend into that pathway of more of a visual essay. The challenge, though, if that were to take place, is how the participants would view those images. So this kind of dialogical discourse method is really challenging because we all bring our unique perspectives on images themselves. So rooting my dissertation in the only perspective that I could really interrogate, which was my own, was the crux of my methodology. Can a white scholar study whiteness in the visual aspects? And I would conclude yes and no. How we see together, who is in the room taking hold and making meaning out of those visuals are really paramount, and I would argue in a visual essay as well. So in an ideal world, I would have loved to have more visuals. I do think it addresses the urgency that my research exposes of the need to study the visual components of whiteness. And hopefully, as I mentioned earlier, it's an invitation for more ecclesial communities to participate in research like this. It's not as scary as it looks. But many of the congregations, particularly the liberal progressive congregations, were the hardest to examine. Which I found particularly disturbing, but also illuminating in how delicate the nature of whiteness is, not just in conservative right spaces, but in conservative left liberal spaces as well.
And one short question, is it okay?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, how would a visual theology look like? It seems that you are more engaged in ethnography.
Yes.
So if you deal with more normative, ontological questions, so I wonder, is it even possible to make a visual theology?
Well, I believe all things are possible. I do not think it is possible if you only have one set of eyes. And so I would invite a diverse community to help craft a visual essay, a visual research project that would help me see what I'm not seeing in the crafting of which images get to participate, which images get to be illuminated, which images get to have their own meaning making outside of one perspective. So it is possible, and I hope it does come to fruition, but I do think it would take a greater diversity of participants to make that real.
Thank you.
Professor Beckford, may I re-invite you for the opposition?
Yes, esteemed candidate, a second question regarding your support from African-American scholars at the end of the study. You draw on interviews and include an affirmation of African-American scholars as part of your methodological approach. Could you clarify how this component functions within your overall ethnographic design? Also, if there is any precedent that you worked with and selection criteria.
Thank you for that excellent question. A question that I wrestled with for about 6 months with my supervisors on how can a white scholar study whiteness with only white perspectives? This is extremely delicate to treat, particularly in the US. I'm not sure if it's the same in the UK, but the resistance to have the African American scholars at the beginning or at the forefront or even interwoven throughout the project was not incidental, but really tied to methodological concerns, specifically about power dynamics, about those power dynamics between white and Black participants. Specifically, if I'm studying white spaces, those dynamics are all the more evident. This is an ethical issue that I wrestled with, particularly about who could participate. One of the terminologies that we use is called Black Pacts. It is the additional intellectual and emotional labor that we put on people of color to do the work for white people. By positioning their engagement at the end here in this research, my method seeks to avoid extractive inclusion while still inviting necessary critique. So part of my ethical process actually culminated with the addition of this methodological approach, is to say, we have got to have other eyes on this research in order to illuminate what you might find in a way that is very humbling, but necessary, particularly as a white scholar.
Thank you. If I can follow up with
Yes,
another
please.
question. How might you then reframe your methodology as not just autoethnographic, but now, as a consequence of this, a more mixed methodological approach? And I'm just wondering how you might then synthesize these two primary methodological commitments.
As I thought about your critique specifically on the section around methodology and how I might even choose a different language, because it is not participatory and it's not necessarily dialogical, because it is really reflective ethnography, because it's coming from my own reflective engagement with the space and then my own reflective engagement with the critiques. And so this is a hybrid, responsive, and I would even say a very intentionally ethical, attuned methodology that created a toolbox along the way. This was not established by chapter 1. It was a very messy process that formulated along the way. Even throughout the research of studying white spaces, I was left wrestling with, when do I bring in the African American scholars? Do I bring them in only to see the space itself? That's not exactly a fair approach. Or do I bring them in to critique my entire project? And so I had to write the entire dissertation and then hand it over to them for critique for a month to read it and then get back to me. I also made sure to compensate them as well. And that in and of itself was an ethical choice, to say, you are using your expertise to participate in this research, so therefore you should not do it for free. You should be compensated as well. So these were all decisions that I illuminated in chapter 4 as intentional, but also a very much messy process along the way of how to actually incorporate them in the end.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dear Professor Foster, would you like to continue the interrogation?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And it's been a joy to listen to your engagement so far, and I'm looking forward to this next series of comments. One of the things that struck me in the reading of your study, but also in listening to you speak now, is the importance of the transgressive nature of what you're doing. So I really want to affirm that in your work, but also for your supervisors, for having the courage and the boldness to support you in that journey. And it strikes me in two ways. The one is one would normally expect the kind of study that you were saying you don't want to do, looking at how other people view these spaces and then extracting their views of that and presenting them to us so that we can evaluate, what they said. So the autoethnographic approach, I think, is one which is particularly important. My question, however, relates to the second one, and in some ways it relates to what Dr. Schremak was saying. So this is an academic dissertation. Hopefully, I'm sure you will receive a Doctor of Philosophy for this. But the question is, how, in a sense, will you transgress the boundary of the academy in this regard? So I think specifically about the work of David Tracy, who says, well, you know, academics are very good at having these kinds of debates in these spaces. We congratulate each other, we develop new things. But what might this mean, for example, for the public of the church?
Mm-hmm.
In what ways do you intend to translate it there? And I think particularly many of us around the world are watching with horror what's happening in the United States. In what ways do you see your study making some transgressive contribution in that space?
Thank you for that excellent question. A question that I continue to ponder today as an active pastor in a predominantly white congregation. How can this work touch the ground in a way that can transform? Even in the early stages of my research question itself transgressed. I changed the word from reform to transform. How can we transform whiteness and not reform it? And that was based upon African-American colleagues of mine critiquing my own question. And so the progressive nature of change, how can we see that in everyday life? I think part of what I will be interested in drawing upon is abolition theory, and really leaning into specifically what do we do with these images that we see in white spaces, but also Black spaces, brown spaces. What do we do with images from the Confederate Army that we have seen dismantled and then put back up? This understanding of retain and explain, is this one approach? I think is very cautionary and very contextual. My initial response is similar to something to James Cone, is to just destroy, not deconstruct. But what I found throughout my research is that these images and these ideological and theological understandings of whiteness live within the psyche. And we saw that in my chapter 3, historically, when iconoclasm took place, images of white Jesus may have physically been taken down, but they were still living within the psyche of many people. And so just to remove something doesn't actually remove something visually, doesn't mean it's going to be removed from our mind's eye. I think abolition theory plays a critical role in how we imagine a way forward. And I think it's because it insists that whiteness is not merely to be interpreted, but to be dismantled. And what does it look like to dismantle whiteness in specific contexts? And how do we give enough attention and explanation as to why images are being removed or are being left up with a little plaque underneath them to establish what these images actually represent? I do believe it will take generations to continue the work of prior generations when it comes to dismantling whiteness.
Yeah, and just to say, you know, I think this is an absolutely crucial issue. By the way, we are hosting a panel on abolition theory at the European Academy of Religion, so join us in Rome for that. But I think that this particular concept is absolutely crucial, and not only in the kinds of spaces that you're talking about, but around the world. And my sense is that Christianity, in some senses, has become entangled in some of this, and what we are seeing as a reaction to this is an attempt at protecting a sense of privilege. I wonder what your response is.
So I find it ironic that you're having this conference in Rome. Like the hub of white iconography and the implications of that. Yeah, so like maybe you're going there to explain whatever you're seeing, particularly in the Vatican. Part of one of the more transformative accounts that I found and I want to do further research on is from our Welsh brothers and sisters. There was a stained glass maker by the name of John Petts who created an image of an African-American Jesus that was then shipped over in 1965 after the bombing of an African-American church that murdered 4 little girls, because one of the images that were destroyed was a white Jesus. I found myself in that same sanctuary last fall. That image of the African-American Jesus is huge and beautiful. I find it very interesting that it's coming from a very white Welsh community, and they had the imagination to participate in transformative work. What I found disturbing is that this congregation, which is still African American, they ended up restoring the white Jesus image that was destroyed. And so this represents the tension that we're constantly seeing is we have two white Jesus images in an African American church with an African American Jesus at the back end. How do we make meaning? How do we make theological, ideological meaning out of such a controversial setting in which people are still worshiping in? I think that is where we need to have further conversations, and I will try to get to Rome.
Thank you, Rector. I'm satisfied.
So we've come full circle twice. I'm looking around to the opponents if there is any additional question to be asked, and just reflect on that. And then this is a bit of out of the ordinary. You made a remark that I'd like to comment on.
Oh.
You said in response to Dr. Schremak, all things are possible. That is a metaphysical statement that I do philosophy am very critical of. Some things are not possible. For instance, it is impossible for the number 2 to become odd. The same holds for the number 4. So it's impossible for a thing to exist and not to exist at the same time. So there are certain things that are inherently impossible. So when you say all things are possible, you are assuming sort of, I think, manners of restriction. So we could say the cupboard is empty. Well, but there are planks in it and there are molecules of air in it. So within that restriction, we're not counting those things. You could say the cupboard is empty. But what were the restrictions you were having in mind when you said all things are possible, nothing is impossible?
I think I was leaning into more of a biblical interpretation of how God makes all things possible. And perhaps that in and of itself is my critique upon your own critique, is our own limitation of seeing how things can be made possible based upon this liminal space that we inhabit, and our limited view and perspective of time itself, and how time itself may even move beyond space itself. And what we imagine today might not be what others imagine tomorrow.
So then you're squarely in the camp of René Descartes, who was a universal possibilist. So he said everything is possible. So for God, he said it's possible to create something and at the same time not create it. He said it's beyond our imaginary possibilities, but for God, everything is possible. There's nothing impossible for God in that metaphysical sense. And it's interesting to note that here in the Netherlands, we had a big debate. So one of the theological critics of Descartes was the theologian Whitaker. And he said, if that's correct, then God is beyond understanding. But now I'm trespassing all the forms that have to do, the formalities that have to do with just being a chair, even a non-philosophical chair of this particular session. But you are about to.
No, I'm just wondering that what the candidate meant is actually everything is possible in the world of ideas and images. So in that way, yeah, I agree.
You said it quite well. Thank you.
Are there any further questions also on the part of the audience? That is allowed.
Rector Magnificus, I would just like to say that a copy of the picture that the esteemed candidate was referring to is hanging in our Welsh chapel here.
Oh, with me. Now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank the opponents for the attention they have devoted to my thesis. I am now really looking forward to the decision of the doctorate committee, which will decide whether the degree of doctorate of philosophy will be granted to me.
I hereby adjourn the public meeting of the Council of Deans for further deliberation.
It's a much more efficient approach, isn't it? All in one day.
Please be seated. I reopen the public meeting. By his duly accorded authority, the doctorate committee grants the degree of Doctor of Philosophy to Erica Lynn Evans Whitaker. I invite the supervisors to place their signature to the degree certificate as witness of this deed. The supervisors are Professor David Gushie, who is sitting to my left, and Dr. Porter, who participates in the ceremony online. Professor Gushie is a Christian ethicist, Baptist pastor, author, and public intellectual. Dr. Porter is a theologian in the UK. She has conducted or contributed to projects for the University of Ulster, the Center of Contemporary Christianity, and many other places. And I declare in public that in the privacy of the closed meeting, the candidate by a signature has stated adherence to the conditions laid down in the provisions in Article 5 of the Doctrine Regulations of the University regarding rights and responsibilities in science and society, which means basically that he has declared to conform to the norms of scientific integrity. I now request colleague Professor Gushie to continue the ceremony, and during the pronouncement of the investiture formula, only the doctorate committee, at least as far as they are physically present in this room, to stand.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the management regulations of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and as supervisor appointed thereto by the College of Deans, I hereby confer on you, Erica Lynn Evans Whitaker, the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, together with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto appertaining. In witness thereof, the seal of the university and signatures of the rector and the supervisors have been affixed to the diploma you are about to receive. Congratulations.
The laudatio will be pronounced by Dr. Porter.
Dr. Whitaker, Erica, on behalf of Professor David Gushy and myself, it is my great pleasure to congratulate you on this award of Doctor of Philosophy. You chose to focus your dissertation on a critical examination of the racialized system of thought, practice, and imagination known as whiteness, as it manifests in the United States. A manifestation compounded because of centuries of denial that there is a problem. A stance further entrenched by the current administration. Therefore, your research, which was timely when you began your doctoral program 6 years ago, remains a pertinent contribution to the task of ending the misery of the whiteness system. In particular, you have explored the way whiteness operates in white Baptist worship spaces in the southern United States, offering a critique of the way whiteness impacts Christian believing and behaving. In naming how whiteness functions and articulating the resulting distortion of human relationships, you offer Christian communities the possibility for repentance, reimagining, and reform. Your research is methodologically creative and I know was challenging to carry out, including having to negotiate an empirical project interrupted by a pandemic. All qualitative research requires attention to reflexivity, where the researcher interrogates themselves for the role they are playing in the emergence of knowledge. With autoethnography, the need for this vigilance is enhanced, and for you, this involved asking the crucial question of how possible is it for a white scholar to unmask whiteness, given its pervasive influence. In your dissertation, you engage with the critique that warns how white researcher reflexive awareness may lead to a self-exoneration that, however unwittingly, endorses rather than dismantles whiteness. As you share your work and develop it further, you will continue to live with the tension of the necessity of white scholars doing this work, and yet the potential danger of yourself and your efforts becoming the story, rather than the focus being about liberation from the harms of the whiteness system. And while that remains true, in these moments, it is right that I say how proud Professor Gushy and I are of what you have achieved in this degree. We have seen your development as a scholar and your growing ability to pursue your argument. You have defended your argument well here today. I think back to our supervision conversations and the way you wrestled with your ideas, forging your own path. As is so often true of good doctoral research, the student became the teacher, and I have learned much from you about the land where you live and something of its history and people, as well as about visual ethnography. During your studies, you have also contributed much to the research community at the International Baptist Theological Study Center, as indeed they have contributed to your development, including Dr. Mike Peers, who was involved in your project at the beginning. IBTS celebrates with you today. It has been my pleasure to accompany you and witness your steadfast commitment to the process of research and to your topic in particular. You have, with maturity and integrity and in timely fashion, completed your doctoral studies, and this award is well deserved. As you go forward, Dr. Whitaker, may you continue in your desire to embody authentic Christian vision that affirms, not distorts, human living and relating. For today, Erica, celebrate with those who love you and enjoy this moment.
To the congratulations of the supervisor, I gladly add the congratulations of the College of Deans of this university for you and those who are near to you. I also want to thank the committee members for their participation. Thank you so much. This PhD ceremony is now almost completed. Doctor of Philosophy Whitaker will now lead the procession out of this hall, and I invite you all to follow. You will have the opportunity to congratulate Dr. Whitaker at the reception area behind the aula. Then I now ask you to stand. I close this public meeting of the College of Deans by uttering the desire that our scientific research for truth and wisdom may be beneficial to the world and to humanity.
Pleasure seeing you all. Take care.